She tossed a $20 bill at him, looked him in the eye, and made him an offer in front of everyone. $1 million if he beat her at chess. Crystal chandeliers lit up a room full of people who had never once questioned their own worth. Jack Sullivan was there to pour their drinks. That was all he was supposed to do. Then Charlotte spotted him standing near the chessboard, and something shifted in her expression, something cold and deliberate. Nothing but his job and his dignity if he lost. The room erupted in laughter. It didn't last long. Jack Sullivan had worked enough of these events to know exactly where he stood the moment he walked through the service entrance. The guests came through the front doors, where valets took their cars, and staff offered them champagne before they'd even removed their coats. Jack came through the back, past the catering vans and the folded linen carts, through a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and reheated appetizers. He knew his role. He had known it for years, and he had made his peace with it, or something close enough to peace that had got him through the night. The Whitmore estate sat on 11 acres in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of property that didn't announce itself from the road. There were no ostentatious gates, no fountains visible from the street. Just a long, private driveway lined with old oak trees, and at the end of it, a house that looked like it had been standing since before anyone currently alive had been born. That kind of wealth didn't need to perform. It simply existed, and everything around it adjusted accordingly. Jack had been assigned to the VIP wing for the evening, a designation that meant less champagne refills and more standing quietly near walls, while people with net worths he couldn't calculate talked about things he had no reason to care about. He had done it before. He was good at the invisibility of it, the particular skill of being present, without being noticed, of anticipating what someone needed before they had to ask. It wasn't a glamorous skill, but it was real, and it had kept him employed consistently across 3 years of working the Connecticut event circuit. The party itself was a celebration, a fund close according to the briefing sheet the agency had sent him the day before. Charlotte Whitmore's investment firm had just finalized a deal that the financial press would spend the following week trying to contextualize. The guests were the kind of people whose names appeared on the sides of university buildings. They moved through the estate's main reception hall with the easy confidence of those who had never once entered a room and wondered whether they belonged there. Charlotte Whitmore herself was exactly what the briefing sheet had implied, and what Jack had already understood from 3 years of working events like this one. She was in her mid-40s, tall with dark hair, pulled back in a style that managed to look both effortless and precise. She wore a single piece of jewelry, a narrow gold bracelet on her left wrist, and a navy dress that cost more than Jack's monthly rent. She worked the room in concentric circles, moving from one cluster of guests to the next, with a fluency that looked social, but functioned like business. She laughed when it was useful, and listened when it was strategic, and the whole room oriented around her the way a compass needle orients toward north. Jack noticed her, the way he noticed all the principals at these events cataloged, filed, given a wide berth. His job was to keep glasses filled and trays moving, not to have opinions about the people holding them. He had long since stopped forming opinions at these events. It cost too much energy for no return. The chess set was in the east sitting room off the main hallway, behind a pair of half-open French doors. Jack passed it 3 times over the first 2 hours of the evening, twice on his way to the kitchen once, when a guest redirected him toward a quieter area of the house. It was not the kind of chess set that existed to be played. The board was inlaid rosewood, the pieces hand-carved from what looked like ivory and obsidian, each one weighted and polished to a degree that made them look more like sculpture than game components. It sat on its own dedicated table, lit from above by a small pendant light, as if it were a painting that happened to be 3-dimensional. The 3rd time Jack passed the doors, he stopped. Not for long, 4 seconds, maybe 5. The board was set up in a mid-game position, pieces arranged as if a match had been interrupted and never resumed. He recognized the position. He didn't mean to recognize it, and he didn't stand there long enough to fully analyze it. but something in his mind snagged on the arrangement of pieces, the way a person catches a familiar face in a crowd before they've consciously registered who it is. He could see from where he stood that whoever had been playing black was 2 moves away from a forced sequence that the white player almost certainly hadn't accounted for. It was a subtle thing, the kind of thing you'd only see if you already knew what to look for. He moved on. He had a tray to return to the kitchen. He didn't know that Charlotte Whitmore had seen him stop. She was in the main hallway mid-conversation with 2 guests when she caught the movement through the French doors out of the corner of her eye. A server, dark jacket, white shirt, silver tray tucked under one arm, standing at the entrance to the sitting room, looking at her chessboard. She kept talking for another 30 seconds before she excused herself. By the time she reached the hallway, Jack was already halfway to the kitchen. She watched him go, and something in her expression settled into a decision. The next time Jack came through the main hallway with a fresh tray, Charlotte was standing near the center of the room with a group of 8 or 9 guests, and she said his name. Not his name specifically, she didn't know his name. She said, "You," loudly enough that several nearby conversations stopped, and she was looking directly at him when she said it. Jack stopped walking. He turned toward her. The tray in his hands was level steady, the glasses undisturbed. "You were looking at my chessboard," Charlotte said. Her tone was not accusatory in the way that implied wrongdoing. It was the tone of someone who had found something mildly amusing and intended to make use of it. "I was passing the room," Jack said. His voice was even. He didn't elaborate. Charlotte's mouth curved slightly. Not warmth, not invitation, just the leading edge of something she had already decided to enjoy. "It's a $40,000 set," she said to the group around her as much as to Jack. "Custom made. I had it commissioned in Prague 8 years ago. I doubt our friend here has seen many of those." There was light laughter from the nearest guests, the reflexive kind that comes not from genuine amusement, but from the social instinct to align with whoever holds the room. Jack said nothing. He had been in enough of these moments to know that words were a liability. He stood there with his tray expression neutral and waited for the moment to pass. It didn't pass. Charlotte was enjoying herself too much for that. "Do you even know how to play?" she asked. "I know the rules," Jack said. More laughter from the group, softer this time. A few people already beginning to sense that the target of this particular joke was handling it with more composure than the joke required. Charlotte noticed it too, the slight recalibration in the room's energy, and it sharpened something in her approach. Knowing the rules and being able to play are 2 very different things, she said. "I've been playing since I was 9 years old. I studied under a grandmaster in my 20s. I haven't lost a match at a social event in 11 years. She said this without bragging, or rather, she said it with the kind of precision that made bragging sound like simple fact. "But I'd be happy to give you a demonstration if you'd like." One of the guests near the back of the group, a heavy-set man in his 60s, with the ruddy complexion of someone who spent his weekends on boats, laughed and said, "Go easy on him, Charlotte." It was the kind of comment that was meant to sound generous, but functioned as an invitation to escalate, and Charlotte accepted it as exactly that. "Actually," she said, her eyes still on Jack, "let's make it interesting." She reached into the small clutch she was carrying and produced a $20 bill. She held it for a moment, then set it on the side table beside the hallway console, with a casualness that made the gesture land harder than if she had thrown it. "I'll offer you a wager," she said. "You play me. 1 game right now. If you win, I'll write you a check for $1 million tonight. Personal check from my account, before you leave this property." She let the number sit in the air for exactly long enough to make sure everyone in earshot had registered it. "And if you lose, you leave. Tonight. Immediately. And I'll make sure every event coordinator in the state of Connecticut knows exactly what kind of server disrupts a private function by snooping around her host's property." The hallway had gone quiet. Not completely quiet. There was still music from the main reception, still the distant clink of glasses, but the conversations within range had all stopped, and at least 30 people were now oriented toward the exchange, several of them with phones already in hand, the instinct to document kicking in before the moment had even fully registered. Jack looked at her. He looked at the $20 bill on the side table. He looked at the faces around him, some amused, some uncomfortable, a few already composing the version of this story they would tell tomorrow. He was aware of exactly what was happening. He had been aware of it from the moment she said, "You," across the hallway. This was not a wager. It was a performance, and he had been cast without his consent in the role of the man who loses. He had two choices. He could decline, take whatever remained of his dignity, and walk back to the kitchen. It was the reasonable choice, the sensible choice, the choice that anyone looking at the situation from the outside would probably recommend. He would lose his contract with this event agency, possibly others. He would be humiliated, but quietly, and the humiliation would fade. The alternative was to sit down at a $40,000 chessboard in front of 30 witnesses with phones in their hands and play a woman who claimed 11 years of unbeaten social matches and a grandmaster education on the worst possible terms for stakes that were designed to be impossible to win and devastating to lose. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took him to set his tray down on the console table beside the $20 bill. He straightened his jacket and said, "Which side do I take?" The laughter that followed was loud and immediate, the kind that carries a current of anticipation underneath it. Charlotte's expression shifted, still controlled, still amused, but with something new behind it, something that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. She gestured toward the east sitting room and said, "After you," with the graciousness of someone who had already decided how this would end. The guests followed in a loose crowd, phones held at waist level, the chess set's pendant light casting a clean white glow over the board as people arranged themselves along the walls of the sitting room. Someone brought Charlotte a fresh glass of wine. No one offered Jack anything. He sat down across from the board, studied the pieces for a moment. To confirm they were set to the standard starting position. They were the mid-game arrangement, cleared and reset, and waited. Charlotte settled into the chair across from him with the unhurried ease of someone who had sat in that seat many times before. She picked up a white pawn and turned it once between her fingers before placing it forward 2 squares. First move. Clean classical central. The kind of opening that said, "I have done this so many times that I don't need to surprise you." Jack looked at the board. He reached forward, moved a piece, and sat back. The room watched. Most of them didn't know enough about chess to understand what they were seeing, and so they watched the people instead. Charlotte's expression, Jack's posture, the gap between them across the rosewood board. They were waiting for the moment when the outcome became obvious for the visual cue that would tell them the story was proceeding as expected. That moment didn't come yet, but it was coming, just not in the direction anyone in the room was prepared for. The first few moves told the room nothing useful. Charlotte played with the measured confidence of someone who had opened 1,000 games, the same way each move placed with a deliberateness that was itself a form of communication, a signal to anyone watching that she wasn't in a hurry, that she had done this before, that the outcome was already understood by everyone who mattered. The guests along the walls shifted their weight, checked their phones, exchanged small smiles. A few whispered to each other. The atmosphere in the sitting room had the quality of a foregone conclusion, waiting politely for itself to arrive. Jack played without ceremony. He didn't study the board for long stretches, or tap his fingers on the table, or show any of the visible signs of concentration that people associate with someone working hard. He looked at the position moved and sat back. His posture was the same as it had been when he was carrying a tray, straight contained, nothing wasted. If the audience was expecting visible struggle, they weren't getting it, and most of them interpreted the absence of struggle as the absence of understanding. They figured he simply didn't know enough to know he was losing. Charlotte made a comment somewhere around the 4th move, something about how refreshing it was to play someone who didn't overthink, delivered with a flat smile directed at the guests rather than at Jack. There was laughter, the easy kind. Jack didn't respond to it. He waited for her to finish, then moved his knight to a square that drew no particular reaction from anyone in the room, except one. Arthur Hale was standing near the far wall, slightly apart from the main cluster of guests. He was in his mid-70s with the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades in rooms where careful observation matters more than loud participation. He had been a competitive chess player for most of his adult life, not a grandmaster, but a national-level competitor in the 1980s and 90s. The kind of player who could look at a board position the way a musician reads a score with immediate and intuitive comprehension. He had come to the party as a guest of one of Charlotte's senior partners, and he had been only mildly interested in the spectacle when it began. He was considerably more interested now. He watched Jack's knight move and said nothing, but his expression shifted just slightly, the way a person's face changes when they hear a familiar voice in an unexpected place. He looked at the board, then at Jack, then back at the board. He took a slow sip from his glass and did not look away again. Charlotte played her next move quickly, the way she had been playing all evening, with the rhythm of someone who had already mapped the game's trajectory and was simply executing it. She was playing to control the center, applying classical pressure, the kind of positional strategy that works reliably against players who don't know how to respond to it. Against a server at a party, it should have been more than sufficient. Jack moved again, and again Arthur Hale's attention sharpened. The thing about the position developing on the board was that it didn't look dramatic. That was the point. To a casual observer, it looked like Charlotte was doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, advancing, controlling, applying pressure. Jack appeared to be responding reactively, placing pieces in positions that looked passive, even uncertain. It was only if you knew what you were looking at, only if you had the specific vocabulary to read the geometry of the board, that the picture resolved into something else entirely. Jack was not responding to Charlotte's strategy. He was constructing something underneath it, move by move in the spaces. She wasn't looking at building a structure that wouldn't become visible until it was already finished. Arthur Hale took a few quiet steps toward the table. He was not the kind of man who pushed through crowds, but the guests near him seemed to sense the shift in his attention and made room without being asked. He stood at the edge of the table and looked at the board for a long moment, his eyes tracking each piece in sequence, methodical and unhurried. Charlotte noticed him move closer and misread it as confirmation of her dominance, another observer coming to watch the inevitable conclusion. "Arthur," she said pleasantly, without taking her eyes off the board, "you'll appreciate this. I'm giving him every opportunity." Arthur didn't answer right away. He studied the position for another few seconds, his eyes moving from piece to piece with the systematic focus of someone running calculations. Then he said quietly, and without any particular drama, "I'm not sure you are." Charlotte looked up. "I'm sorry." "His knight placement," Arthur said, nodding at the board. "And his bishop. Look at the diagonal." He didn't elaborate further. He straightened up and stepped back slightly, his expression returning to something neutral, as if he had said enough and had no interest in saying more. Charlotte looked back at the board. For the first time since the game began, her eyes moved across the position with something other than routine confidence. She looked at the knight Jack had moved 3 turns ago. She looked at the bishop. She traced the diagonal Arthur had mentioned, and then she traced the one adjacent to it, and then she sat back in her chair with a stillness that was different from her earlier stillness, tighter, more internal. The guests closest to the table had heard Arthur's comment, and the ones who hadn't heard it could read the change in Charlotte's posture well enough to understand that something had shifted. The easy murmuring that had filled the room began to quiet. Phones, which had been held loosely at waist level in standby mode, were raised again. A few people near the back craned their necks to see the board, even though they had no way to interpret what they were looking at. Charlotte made her next move. It was still strong. She was too experienced a player to collapse under a single moment of doubt. But it was slightly slower than her previous moves, and it had a defensive quality to it that hadn't been there before. She was adjusting, recalculating, trying to locate the edges of whatever she had not seen. Jack looked at her move. He looked at the board. He moved, and the move was quiet and unhurried, and landed in a square that Charlotte had not prioritized, and for a reason she could not immediately articulate it, bothered her more than it should have. The guests were beginning to divide, not into two loud factions, the room was too restrained for that, but into two distinct registers of attention. The majority were still watching with the assumption that this was running on its original track, that Charlotte's moment of hesitation was a momentary theatrical beat and not a structural development. But a smaller group, the ones closest to Arthur, the ones who had caught the shift in Charlotte's expression, were watching differently now, with the focused quietness of people who suspect they might be watching something real. Charlotte played again, and this time the move took her almost 40 seconds. It was not a complicated position on its surface, but she was no longer trusting the surface. She was looking deeper, tracing lines, running contingencies. And the more she looked, the more she found Jack's pieces in places she hadn't adequately accounted for, positioned not to threaten immediately, but to constrict, to limit, to gradually remove her options the way a room loses air when the windows are closed one by one. She understood somewhere around her seventh move that she was not controlling the game. She had been controlling the appearance of the game. The underlying reality was something else, and it had been something else since at least the third move, possibly earlier, and the man across from her had known it the whole time, and had given her no indication whatsoever. "You've played before," she said. Her voice was still social, but the register had changed. She wasn't performing for the room anymore. She was talking to Jack directly for the first time since the game began. Jack looked at her across the board. "You asked if I knew the rules," he said. "I told you I did." The observation was not combative. It wasn't even pointed exactly. It was just accurate, and its accuracy landed in the room with a weight that several people visibly registered. A few glances exchanged a quiet sound from somewhere near the back that might have been a laugh cut short. Charlotte's eyes returned to the board. She picked up her queen, a gesture that committed her to nothing yet, and then set it back down without moving it. It was the first time she had touched a piece without playing it, the first visible sign of a decision reversed. In competitive chess, touching a piece without intending to move it is considered a lapse. In front of a room full of witnesses, it was the kind of small detail that people would remember later. She found a move eventually. It was defensively sound, the kind of move that prioritizes survival over advancement, and it acknowledged implicitly what she wasn't willing to state explicitly, that she was no longer advancing. She was trying to hold. Somewhere across the room, one of Charlotte's business partners, a tall man in his 50s named Gregory Walsh, who had invested in 3 of her funds and played recreational chess at a club in Westport, had been watching the board closely enough to understand the broad shape of what was happening. He had entered the sitting room 20 minutes earlier, expecting to watch Charlotte dismantle a server in 4 moves. What he was watching instead was something considerably more interesting, and he was self-aware enough to recognize that his interest had shifted from entertainment to documentation. He didn't say anything, but he took his phone out of his jacket pocket and made sure the video was running, and he angled the screen carefully to keep both the board and Charlotte's face in frame. Arthur Hale remained where he was near the edge of the table watching the board, with an expression that had settled into something like quiet concern. Not concern for the game's outcome that he was becoming increasingly certain about, but concern for what happened after. He had been around enough high-stakes environments to know that the moment when powerful people realize they are losing is frequently more dangerous than the loss itself. He had seen it in boardrooms and in tournament halls, and in rooms not entirely unlike this one, and the pattern was consistent. The more public the loss, the more unpredictable the response. Jack made his ninth move his own ninth, the one that completed the sequence he had been building since the third move. He placed his rook on an open file that Charlotte had left uncontested earlier, a file that now connected directly to her king's position. In doing so, the relationship between the rook and the knight and the bishop that had been sitting quietly for the past several moves snapped into a single coherent picture that was impossible to misread if you had any chess literacy at all. The trap had been there for 6 moves. Charlotte had been walking into it the entire time without seeing it, and now she was standing inside it, and there was no door. Charlotte stared at the board. She stared at it for a long time. The room had gone quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected has already happened, but no one has said so yet. "That's a forced sequence," Arthur said from his position near the table. He said it the way he had said everything else quietly without drama, as a statement of observation rather than declaration. "From this position." He did not say who was forcing it or in which direction, but the board made that clear enough for anyone who could read it, and for the ones who couldn't, Charlotte's expression said the rest. Charlotte's jaw was set. Her hand was flat on the table beside the board, not touching any piece, and she was looking at the position with the focused intensity of someone searching a locked room for a door that wasn't there. The guests near the front had gone completely still. Phones were up across the room. Gregory Walsh had angled his screen toward the board. 2 women near the window had stopped their conversation mid-sentence and were watching Charlotte's face instead of the board, because Charlotte's face was where the story was. Charlotte Whitmore had not lost a social chess match in 11 years. She had said so herself in front of this room less than 40 minutes ago. She had said it with the ease of someone stating a fact, so settled it barely needed mentioning. And now she was sitting across from a man in a server's jacket who had walked through the service entrance that evening and had not once in the entire course of this game shown her what he actually was until it was too late to do anything about it. She made one more move. It was the only move available to her that didn't immediately collapse her position, and it bought her exactly one more turn before the sequence Arthur had named would complete itself. She played it with a steady hand. Whatever she was feeling, she was not going to let it show in her hands. Jack looked at the board. He looked at it for exactly as long as he needed to, and not a second longer. And then he reached forward and placed his bishop on the square that closed the sequence. The square that connected every line of pressure he had been building since the third move, and the position became in that instant a problem with no solution. The room understood before Arthur said anything. They understood it from Charlotte's stillness, from the geometry of the pieces, from the particular quality of silence that had settled over the sitting room like a change in air pressure. But Arthur said it anyway, because it needed to be said out loud, because the room needed a voice to confirm what it was seeing. "She's in a forced checkmate," he said. "There's no way out from here." Nobody moved first. That was the thing about the moment Arthur Hale named it. The room didn't erupt, didn't burst into noise the way a crowd does when something unexpected happens at a sporting event. It went the other direction. It compressed. 30 people standing along the walls of Charlotte Whitmore's sitting room, and for 3 or 4 full seconds, not one of them made a sound. They just stood there with their phones up and their drinks forgotten, looking at a chessboard that had just told them something they hadn't been prepared to hear. Charlotte was still looking at the board when the silence broke. She wasn't looking for a move anymore. There was no move Arthur had said so, and she knew it was true. She was looking at the position, the way a person looks at a contract, after they've already signed it and found the clause they missed. The moves were laid out in front of her in the arrangement of pieces, each one a decision she had made with full confidence, and the sum of them was a position she could not escape. Less than 15 minutes, in front of everyone she knew, Jack sat back in his chair and said nothing. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at Charlotte with any expression that could be read as satisfaction. He looked at the board the way he had looked at it through the entire game, with the same contained attention he had brought to every move, and he waited. Charlotte stood up. She didn't knock the pieces over, didn't make any dramatic gesture. She simply stood, straightened her dress, and addressed the room in the tone she used for all professional communications, controlled, clear, already managing the next thing. "Well," she said, "that was more interesting than I expected." She looked around at the nearest cluster of guests with the composed ease of someone resetting a room's temperature. "I think we can all agree this was a fun diversion." The room received this in silence for a beat too long. Then Gregory Walsh, standing near the window, with his phone still angled at the board, said, "Charlotte." Just her name, nothing else, but the way he said it carried a full sentence's worth of meaning. Charlotte looked at him. "Gregory, you made a wager," he said. "In front of all of us. On record." He tilted his phone slightly, not aggressively, just enough to make the point without needing to make it louder. "I'm aware of what I said," Charlotte replied. Her voice remained even, but something behind it had shifted into a register that the people who knew her well would have recognized as the early stage of a decision being made in real time. "I was being generous. It was a party game. Everyone here understood the spirit of it." From the far side of the room, a woman named Diane Forsyth, a senior partner at a law firm that had worked with Charlotte's fund for 6 years, spoke carefully. "Charlotte, I heard what you said. The terms were specific. A personal check from your account before he leaves the property. Those were your words." Diane was not confrontational by nature, but she was precise, and precision was its own form of pressure. The room had shifted again, more noticeably this time. The guests who had been watching with amusement were watching with something else. Now, something attentive and slightly uncomfortable, the way people look when a social situation reveals itself to be about something more than anyone initially signed up for. Several more phones were up. The video that Gregory Walsh had started was still running, and he hadn't lowered it. Charlotte looked at Jack, who was still seated at the board, still not performing anything for the room. He was watching her with the same quiet steadiness he'd had all evening, and there was something in that steadiness, its consistency, its complete refusal to escalate or plead or posture, that was harder to dismiss than outright confrontation would have been. He wasn't threatening her. He wasn't appealing to the room. He was simply sitting there in a server's jacket, in a chair at her $40,000 chessboard, and he had already won, and every person in the room knew it. The bet was a joke, Charlotte said, directing it at the room rather than at any one person. It was theatrical. Everyone here is sophisticated enough to understand the difference between a real legal commitment and a social gesture at a private party. She moved away from the chess table, creating physical distance from the board, from Jack, from the position on the pieces that was still sitting there as evidence. "I'm not writing a check for $1 million to a server I met 40 minutes ago. That's not what happened here." The room did not agree with her, and it showed. Not loudly, this was not the kind of crowd that erupted in protest, but in the accumulation of small signals that circulate through a room full of people who have spent their careers reading exactly these kinds of signals. Eyes not meeting hers. Bodies angling slightly away. A few people lowering their phones, not because they had stopped recording, but because they had already recorded enough and were now simply watching. Arthur Hale, who had not moved from his position near the chess table, spoke without raising his voice. "I've been playing chess for 50 years, he said. "What this man just did, the sequence he constructed from move 3 onward, is not something you learn by knowing the rules. I don't know who he is or where he learned to play, but the wager was real, and the win was real, and everyone in this room knows both of those things." He wasn't looking at Charlotte when he said it. He was looking at the board as if the board itself was the record he was reading from. Charlotte turned toward him. Whatever she had been about to say, she didn't say it. Arthur was not one of her junior partners or one of the ambient guests she could redirect with social pressure. He was old enough and credentialed enough and sufficiently uninterested in her approval to be immovable, and she knew it. Arguing with Arthur Hale about chess in front of 30 witnesses who had the game on video was not a position she could win, and she was too intelligent to try. Jack stood up from the chair. He did it without urgency, the same way he'd done everything else that evening. No theater, no announcement. He straightened his jacket and looked at Charlotte directly. "You set the terms," he said. "One game. Those were yours, not mine. I sat down because you put them on the table in front of 30 people, and I played because I agreed to play. And the game is over." He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't asking for anything. He was simply stating the sequence of events in order the way a person reads back a record to confirm it's accurate. The words were plain, and they were enough. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. The room was very quiet. She had managed rooms like this. Her entire career had turned hostile. Board meetings, had navigated regulatory hearings, had handled the kind of public pressure that broke people who were less composed than she was. But those situations had always given her some structural advantage. Information the other side didn't have, relationships she could leverage, time she could use to reposition. This room gave her none of that. The witnesses were too numerous, the video was already made, and the man standing across from her was offering nothing she could negotiate against. He was simply right, and everyone present could see it. She looked at Gregory Walsh. He gave her nothing back, not hostility, not sympathy, just the steady attention of someone who had invested significant money in her fund based on the premise that she was a person of her word and who was now in the process of updating that premise. She looked at Diane Forsyth, who met her eyes briefly, and then looked at the middle distance in the way that lawyers look when they are deciding whether something they have witnessed requires follow-up. Charlotte walked to the writing desk at the far end of the sitting room. She opened the top drawer, removed a leather-bound checkbook, and stood there for a moment with a pen in her hand. The room watched her. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint music still drifting in from the main reception hall, unaware that the party had fundamentally changed. She wrote the check with her back partially to the room, and when she turned around and walked back toward the chess table, her expression had the particular blankness of someone who has made a decision they intend to survive. She held the check out toward Jack. He took it. He looked at it once, not triumphantly, not with visible relief, just the brief confirming look of someone verifying an amount, and folded it once and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. "Thank you," he said. Charlotte said nothing. She set the pen down on the chess table next to the board, where the pieces were still arranged in the position that had ended her 11-year unbeaten record, and she walked back toward the main reception hall without addressing the room. Her heels were quiet on the hardwood. The guests parted to let her through. The sitting room exhaled. People began talking first, in low clusters, then in wider conversations. The energy of the room releasing itself in the way it always does after a pressure that has been building finally finds its exit. Gregory Walsh lowered his phone and exchanged a look with Diane Forsyth that communicated several things without either of them needing to say any of them aloud. Arthur Hale remained near the chess table, looking at the board for another moment before he turned away. He didn't say anything further to anyone. He picked up his drink from the windowsill where he'd left it and moved back toward the main hall, and his expression carried nothing that looked like satisfaction, only the quiet recognition of someone who had seen something true and had said so. Jack stood where he was for a few seconds after Charlotte left. He was aware of people looking at him, some approaching, a few wanting to shake his hand or say something to him about what they had just witnessed. He accepted 2 handshakes without prolonging them, gave short civil answers to the questions that were asked, and then made his way back toward the hallway. He picked up his tray from the console table where he had left it. The $20 bill was still there on the same surface where Charlotte had placed it before the game. He looked at it for a moment. Then he left it where it was, picked up the tray, and carried it back toward the kitchen. The weeks that followed were not quiet. The videos that had been recorded in the sitting room circulated faster than anyone had anticipated, and the story they told was visually simple enough to travel without explanation. A chessboard, a server, a billionaire, 9 moves. The coverage that came after in the financial press, and then in broader outlets, added context and complication, the terms of the wager. The 11-year claim Arthur Hale's on-camera confirmation of what he had witnessed, the footage of Charlotte walking to the writing desk. It was the kind of story that attached itself to things people already felt strongly about. And so it spread in the way those stories do, carried by people who had never met any of the people involved and never would. For Charlotte Whitmore, the fallout was real and lasting. 2 of her fund's limited partners requested meetings within the week, formal meetings, scheduled through her assistant, the kind that don't get requested casually. Gregory Walsh sent an email that was professional in its language and unambiguous in its implication. Diane Forsyth's firm quietly declined to renew their advisory contract when it came up 3 months later. None of these things destroyed Charlotte's business. She was too established and too capable for any single incident to do that, but they cost her in the specific currency that her world ran on, which was the confidence of the people whose money she managed. Trust once visibly cracked requires a long time to reseal, and the video made the crack permanent, in a way that a private disagreement never would have. Charlotte did not make public statements about the evening. She did not issue apologies or attempt to reframe the narrative through interviews. She was too smart for any of that, and too proud. What she did in the months that followed was quieter and more private, a shift in how she ran her meetings, a gradual adjustment in the way she occupied rooms she had previously dominated without thinking. Whether it constituted genuine change or simply the modification of visible behavior was not something the people around her could easily determine. Perhaps she couldn't either. Jack Sullivan left the Whitmore estate that night through the service entrance the same way he had arrived. The check was folded in his inside pocket. The tray had been returned to the catering coordinator, his jacket exchanged for the coat he'd left in the staff room. He drove home on the same roads he always drove through the same Connecticut night, and he didn't call anyone or stop anywhere. There was nothing to announce, and no one waiting for the announcement. He deposited the check the following Monday morning at the branch he always used with the same teller who processed his bi-weekly paychecks from the agency. She looked at the amount once, and then looked at him, and he thanked her and left. 6 months later, he opened a small training center in Bridgeport, 2 rented rooms above a dry cleaner on a street that got enough foot traffic to matter, but not enough to make the rent unaffordable. The center offered chess instruction and reasoning workshops available to anyone who wanted to learn, and could work around a schedule that accommodated people who didn't have conventional hours. He ran it himself, supplemented by 2 volunteers who had reached out after the story circulated, and whose credentials he had verified before he accepted their help. The furniture was second-hand. The chess sets were functional, not decorative. No rosewood boards, no hand-carved pieces, nothing that needed a pendant light to justify its existence. Just boards and pieces and enough table space for people to think without being crowded. He was asked more than once in the months that followed how he had learned to play the way he played. He gave different answers in different contexts, none of them complete, all of them honest. He said he had started young. He said he had practiced a long time. He said that chess at its core was a game about attention, about seeing what was actually on the board, rather than what you expected to see there. He said that the 2 things were not as similar as people assumed. He never talked about the Whitmore estate, or the 9 moves, or the check, unless someone asked him directly, and even then he kept it brief. The story had already traveled further than he had, and said everything it needed to say. He didn't feel the need to add to it. The rosewood chessboard was still in Charlotte's sitting room, the pieces presumably reset to their starting positions, waiting for the next game. Jack's center had 12 sets, none of them worth more than $40 apiece. On the morning he opened the doors for the first time, he set up one of them on the front table near the window pieces in the standard starting position and left it there, an open invitation, visible from the street, to anyone who happened to walk by and look in. The game was the same regardless of the board. That had always been the point.